Very good. So if we want to try to find a couple of keywords of the era that has ended, and I'm going to try to do this here, and I have to add the caveat that I'm going to generalize and simplify a bit. I'm also not going to make the case that we are seeing a clear break between an old era and a new era. I think there are lots of different things from the past era that is, basically carried into the new era. It's not that Donald Trump or anyone else have suddenly broken an old structure, an old system apart that is sort of beyond redemption. I think we are rather seeing gradual shifts over a long period of time, and that many of these shifts started before the arrival of Donald Trump in the White House or before we had disruption in European politics. But what I want to say is basically that for a long time, 25, 30, perhaps even 40 years, a guiding principle of the thinking of international economic policy in Europe as well as abroad was that we wanted to reduce government influence in shaping the course of the economy. That doesn't mean that government was not going to have an influence at all. They had huge influence through, for instance, taxes, through government spending. But when we think about policies like, for instance, central banking, or when we think about trade policy, when we think about what we tried to achieve in the European Union when we created the common market and the single market and moved on from there, was largely to have rules, institutions, and predictability injected into the policy that was going to guide how the economy was shaped. We wanted to avoid many of the discretionary power structures that existed before, where politicians or individuals in government had huge discretionary power in order to perhaps distribute advantages to different entrepreneurs or different companies, but not to others, where central banks operated a policy where it was largely impossible for anyone outside the decision room to try to understand what the long-term ambition was. So we got a policy based on rules and institutions, a sort of classic ordoliberal idea about how we wanted to shape the economy, largely in order to give much more predictability. We had a period of pretty benign demographic balance in the sense that the working population could, with relative ease, support people that were not at work, people that were either retired or people that were young, and part of a constantly growing educational sector where people spent more time in education than they did before. This demographic balance also helped the growth of the international economy in the sense that we had, from the 1960s and a couple of decades onwards, quite many young people that were ready to enter the labor force and presented companies and others with opportunities to scale up, to expand, to increase production without being confronted with problems of having a shortage of labor. We had the introduction of women into the workforce, which led to also a huge expansion of the labor supply in the economy, and which also helped sort of to create the basic pillars of many of the welfare structures we have today in order to support that people are going to be at work rather than to stay at home. We had, as Professor Felbermayr showed in his previous presentation, an enormously strong trade-driven model of economic integration, largely based on manufacturing and consumer goods. These were sort of the two areas where trade was growing at the fastest pace. And that type of trade gradually became global. While it started being sort of more transatlantic and perhaps more European, it gradually became more global and included, in due course, many of the emerging markets that now have gained prominence in the world economy. And they largely stepped into the world economy through trade and investment in manufacturing and consumer goods. But there were a couple of other characteristics in sort of the type of framework and system that we've had. One was a process of cultural denationalization, largely a norm, a type of liberal norm, where we gradually expanded the spheres of loyalties. They grew outside our national borders. We gradually became occupied with the health and welfare and the lives of people that lived outside our own national territories. We had a pretty strong norm of internationalism culturally, in the sense that it was premiered, that we were trying to sort of to break into and understand cultures outside our own borders, rather than to try to understand ourselves so much more than we already had. There was also in that cultural sphere, a broad acceptance of technocratic global governance, that we were ready to ship sovereignty to institutions outside national borders, outside the national structures for legitimacy and authority. And that was we did that in Europe, we did that internationally. Many other countries in the world found their own patterns of trying to pull sovereignty, perhaps not in the same sophisticated way as in Europe, but they were moving in that particular direction themselves. And there was a broad acceptance that even if it wasn't possible for people to vote about the particular course of policies that were taken in these global governance structures, people largely accepted that this was legitimate. They weren't rebelling against it. Finally, and for want of a better word, I think that there existed something that we can call visionary generosity in power politics and global politics, in the sense that, especially on the part of America, who was the hegemon power for such a long time, when they were largely accepting the idea that other countries, through the help of the United States, was going to grow their economy pretty fast, perhaps even catch up with the US economy, perhaps even at some time begin to rival the US economy in technological sophistication, in innovation, and capacity to shape sort of the new markets that are going to grow. We had, here in Europe, strong support from America when we were trying to rebuild our economies and our societies after the war. We had, to take just another example, we had pretty strong American support for China to join the World Trade Organization in 2001, despite America knowing that this is going to give an enormous boost to growth in China and help China to become a much, much larger economy. Perhaps they weren't expecting that China was going to grow as fast as it did during the 2000s, but America largely accepted the principle that at one point in the future, China is going to be a larger economy in the US economy, and is going to be able to exercise its economic power in the world, sometimes in conflict with US interests. If we then turn to the era that is beginning right now, and as I said initially, it's not that we are moving away completely from the old era. There are large chunks of rules, institutions, and norms that are still alive, and that probably are going to be alive for quite some time. But if the one thing we're seeing right now, it is what I would call the return of discretionary economic authority, which is largely based on the erosion of rules and institutions that we created in order to have a predictable policy for the world economy or for other local economies. We have, for instance, in central banking, a return or new philosophies of central banking, which is pretty much different from the ones that guided us through the late 1980s, the 1990s, and the early 2000s. We have growing trade restrictions in the world economy, both in terms of old bread and butter type of trade policies like tariffs, but also new ones. Trade restrictions that come in, for instance, the digital economy, and that are a new type of trade restrictions that didn't exist before. We don't have a benign demographic balance anymore. We rather have, if not a malign, so at least a problematic demographic balance in many Western societies, and of course lots of other societies as well, including China and Japan, where there is a growing competition for resources inside countries as well as between countries, where especially there is competition for tax revenues, where there is conflicts between different generations inside societies, whether we're going to allocate more resources to pension systems or whether we're going to do it to educational systems. Internationally, we have a growing conflict between countries because every country wants to poach tax revenues from global firms. And if they don't get as much tax as they think they should, they try to find other means in order to take that. But when they do that, for instance, when France now is introducing a digital tax or a national sales tax on digital services, it's going to lead to reciprocal actions from other countries where they're going to take tax that today is collected by European governments. So we have sort of a growing conflict around tax revenues, which is partly driven by the fact that we have a difficult demographic balance where we need to have more and more resources in order to pay for that we live longer and that we demand more healthcare in the future. We have an ideas-based economy, which is growing and is going to lead to continued economic integration. It's not that we see a break in globalization, just as Professor Felbermayr said in his previous talk. We see pretty strong growth in different services in the economy today, especially digital services. But what we're not seeing is a continued strong globalization in trade in goods. And you can see this from this slide, where you see sort of the bars are for trade in goods. Then you have services exports in green, and then you have digital services, and it's an index on the growth rate of trade in these particular areas. So even if there's sort of a flattening for service and digital service as well, there is in the economy a pretty strong fundament in right now, which leads to more integration. And that fundament is basically constituted by knowledge, human capital, R&D, innovation, technology, which is very, very difficult to try to stop crossing the borders. So if someone comes up with a brilliant idea in India, it's very difficult to stop that person for sharing that brilliant idea with someone in Salzburg or with someone in another part of the world. And I think that this type of economic integration is going to continue. That sort of the ideas-based economy, the way that we share ideas, is going to survive any type of onslaught that comes from people like Donald Trump and others. Two other points we're seeing in this new era. The first one is the rediscovery of national identity. And here I think we can put a question mark about where the trend is going, whether it's a growing interest about defining our loyalties, whether we have loyalties inside the national territory, which should be stronger than loyalties we have with people living in other parts of the world, and whether the shared ancestry creates a form of loyalty pattern which should be given primacy over other forms of loyalty patterns that people can create between each other. So on the one hand, we can see this type of trend, which can manifest itself in so many, many different forms, and most of us are included in that. We are increasingly interested in many of these things, but that's pretty different from an exclusive form of nationalism, especially a white form of nationalism in Western countries. But the problem is that we're also seeing a growth in that type of ideas, and that type of idea about what your country and what your nation should represent. So even if it's not going to take such an extreme form, I think we are on a larger trend in Europe, America, as well as other parts of the world, where we are increasingly interested in defining loyalty patterns which have much more of a national content than it has an international content, and where there is a growing feeling that the fact that we share ancestry inside national borders will also come to manifest itself much more in politics. I think this form of national identity is perhaps more or stronger outside Europe than it is inside Europe. I don't think we're seeing the growth of a supreme Chinese nation who is going to dominate Asia, let alone the globe. I think what we're seeing in Asia is the growth of what has been called Eastphalia, a pattern sort of a new form of modernism, a new form of nation creation and nation identity, which we have seen in our parts of the world in history, but now is getting a much stronger foothold in Asia. And where we see rivalry between countries which are getting stronger and stronger, where it would be easy to think that the enormous economic growth of China would be sort of this power which sucks in everything in the Asian region into sort of a China-based economic interest sphere. We are broadly seeing countries in Asia which are getting increasingly frustrated with China, who refuse to accept the notion that there's going to be Chinese political dominance in the Asian region, in the East Asian region, the Southeast Asian region, let alone the South Asian region, and where other countries are creating patterns of alliances which are, in essence, about trying to stop China from becoming too large and too powerful there. We're also seeing the Europeanization of America, in the sense that America was founded on a different idea than most European countries were. The United States doesn't have a national language. It doesn't have a national religion. It doesn't have sort of the notion of ancestry and ethnicity that came to dominate many of the European nations that were created. Now we're seeing that. We're seeing sort of the growth of opinions in America, which are pointing in that particular direction to try to replicate a period of European history where we became occupied with trying to define ourselves and define what we represent in terms of language, culture, ethnicity, etc. I don't think that is true for all Americans. You know as well as I do that there are huge differences between a typical Trump supporter and someone who lives in more of an urban metropolitan type of American culture. But even among the urban metropolitan societies in America, there is this growth of also trying to define themselves and their own nation in a different way from the one they've been used to in the past. Finally, we're seeing in this new era a greater occupation about redressing perceived injustices in global relations. We see especially an American leadership which is grievance-based and which is trying to sniff up any type of relation in the world which they think have been disadvantageous to America. Donald Trump has called lots of different trade agreements the worst trade agreements in the world. The trade agreement that they did with Korea was the worst trade agreement ever done in world history, until he began to talk about NAFTA and the North American Free Trade Agreement, which then was the worst free trade agreement ever done in history. And then he goes through all type of relations that America have created with others in international economic policy, and he gets sort of to the grievance that he thinks America should have with them, and that can be defined on the fact that the United States has a trade deficit with that country. It can be that maybe a specific American company that cannot sell into that country as easy as they thought they were going to do after the completion of a free trade agreement. But this is sort of the Trump style of domestic politics as well as international politics. It's grievance-based, and he tries to seek it up and redress it. It can be trade policy, it can be sanctions against Iran, or policies in the Middle East. It's grievance-based, and it leads, of course, to much slower acceptance of technocratic global governance, an acceptance of a reduced acceptance of multilateral institutions, whether it's United Nations, whether it's international environmental agreements, whether trade agreements. He doesn't like the notion that we can have institutions that create rules which discipline government behaviors. So, in conclusion here, the world that we are entering is a world which is going to be much less predictable. It's not a world which is going to lead to deglobalization or where we return to autarkic type of economic systems where we don't trade with each other. On the contrary, we're going to have lots of economic integration with each other in the future. But it's a world which is going to be less predictable. It's going to be less dominated by institutions, less dominated by rules. It's going to we're going to see sort of a lot more discretionary power invested in different national economic authorities, whether that's going to be presidents or central banks, in how they are going to manage events and situations that they are confronted with. And the acceptance broadly for trying to rejuvenate that sort of spirit of 1944 and the spirit of the Bretton Woods system that we're celebrating the 75th anniversary for this summer, it's simply not there. It's not a world where we are going to build or make stronger different type of economic institutions that we have. So where is Europe then in that era, and where do we find ourselves when we think about the structural economic changes that are happening, the growth of the ideas-based economy, not least through rapid digitalization of goods production as well as services production? Well, if there's one thing we're seeing, it's that the structural transformation in Europe is varied. It's not sort of a singular story. Europe is not a singular story. Europe is not a story about we being better or we being worse than others. Europe is largely a story about there's huge variations between countries and between regions and countries, how well we are managing this particular transition. But if we try to take sort of an average and find how fast this transition is going, we can clearly say that it's going comparatively slow, in the sense that it's not going as fast as in Europe as it does in other comparable parts of the economy. And I think we need sort of to slice that proposition up in order to understand where the problems are and what we can do to fix them. We used to have one problem in Europe, which was that the amount of investments that we made in infrastructure, in digital infrastructure, in network capacity, was not as good as in other parts, comparable parts of the world. I don't think that's true anymore. I think we've seen sort of a pretty strong growth of our digital endowment, sort of all the capital that we create in order to make use of digital opportunities. We see also that in digital human capital, that people are getting better and better at using digital opportunities. What we're not seeing and what we're weaker at is what I call digital intensities, which is that the power of all these endowments to generate economic output and generate economic growth. That when you compare Europe to many other comparable parts of the world, you're going to see that they use their endowments more than we do. They have a higher intensity in their economic output from these endowments. And this is not about Europe not being able to generate entrepreneurs in the digital economy, or that we don't have European companies that are performing well in the digital economy. We actually do have that, quite many. The problem here is that we find that the rest of the economy has been slow to adapt many of the technologies that exist. It's not that we lack an IT sector or a software sector which is not as good as the IT and software sector in other parts of the world, is that all the non-ICT sectors have been slow to bring in technologies into their own firms and power their own growth with it. And this is the transition that we are going to go through now, which is that we're moving from sort of an Adam Smith type of growth model to more of a Joseph Schumpeter type of growth model, to paraphrase that Austrian economist, in the sense that what many of these technologies are going to do is that they're going to sort of compete out old forms of economic behaviors and old forms of capital that we had in the economy. That if we want to speed up the pace of digital economic growth and get stronger intensities, stronger digital intensities in our economy, we need to have more what Schumpeter called creative destruction in the economy, because that's eventually is what's going to help Europe to catch up with the pace of growth in the digital economy elsewhere. My last point, and I'm going to end there, is that, and here I think we can present it as a problem, but we also can present it as a huge opportunity, which is that we're seeing a disassociation between the EU single market and the European economic development, for the simple reason that the structural transformation of the economy takes us away from a goods-dominated economy to a services and digital-intense economy. And when it comes to services and when it comes to the digital economy, we're not as well integrated in Europe as we are in the goods-based economy. I was going to show you different type of slides showing how different we are in Europe, the heterogeneity in our own regulations in Europe, and how that is affecting our capacity to make use of the big European market in order to grow faster. I was also going to talk a little bit about this slide, which basically shows that in the bars you can see the different sectors where we have the highest forms of digital intensities, which have powered their output more than others have with the use of digital technologies. And then we can see the dots, which looks at the extent to which we have services restrictions inside the EU, where we don't have a single market in the EU, which basically prevents companies, investors, labor from easily moving across borders. And what we can see here is a clear pattern that the lower that these services restrictions are, the higher the digital intensities in that particular sector. And this we can see in so many, many different shapes and forms that, and this is sort of the value proposition that I think exists here from the EU, which is that if we move ahead with the single market, if we deepen it, if we take away many of the restrictions that exist in the services sector, in the digital economy between European countries today, we're going to find a European economy that is going to not just move faster in its digitalization, but it's also going to generate a lot more economic output on all the investments that we're already making in creating digital societies today. Thank you.
Since we are short of time, I'll just make a comment and ask you to comment on my comment, if you would. I think your comments on the China evolution and how the US is taking it may be slightly simplistic. You have not talked about the Thucydides trap. And really, in the view of many people, including myself, that is really what has triggered a lot of the reaction, and much more may come. So I think it's very simplistic to say that, China is growing, we all know that. But if you deal with China, which I have dealt with for several years, they never talk about relations with other countries and why are you doing this and are you getting pressure from other countries not to deal with us. I think the Thucydides trap captures that whole chapter very well. So I won't go into the details. I'm sure you can comment on it if you feel like. Secondly, in my experience of dealing with China, being in public office for so long, they are growing themselves. So they are having a global approach to helping other people, like countries like Pakistan and many others, but they themselves have a long way to go. And their domestic agenda is really what their major priority is. And then comes the international agenda. That's just from personal experience. But I would just close by saying that the Thucydides trap, there's no better example in the world today than this current situation of China's emergence. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Im Moment sehe ich keine Frage. Da noch eine.
Thank you. I'm Rupert Straffitz from the Mesnata Foundation. I was a bit surprised that in your analysis of the old Europe and new Europe, you didn't mention a whole arena of players that has become extremely important, and that is civil society. If you look at some of the really big issues, climate change, population growth, these kind of issues, it has always been, or for the last generation, it's been civil society that has been first in pushing these issues, in driving these issues. And so that if we move from an old Europe to a new Europe, I think we have to take this into account, that it's not just business and government, or the market and the state, it is also civil society. Thank you.
Okay, good. I don't see more, or any comments to it? I don't see any more questions. Also not to Professor Felbermayer's speech. Okay, then we continue, and I thank you.
Thank you.